Welcome to Notes 1.7 for Ms. Richardson's U.S. History class. These cover progressive African Americans and progressive women, so it covers the issues that both of those groups were concerned about. It is the second set of notes for Part 3 of your study guide. So we're going to start with African Americans and their fights during the Progressive Era. And one of their big fights is against the Jim Crow laws in the Jim Crow South. Now, some of these laws also existed in the North, but they were really prevalent in the South and they lasted the longest time there. So after the Civil War, African Americans really had two choices. One was to stay where they were at and continue to work for the people who used to be the slave owners. The second was to move to northern cities and find jobs competing with immigrants. And as we know from earlier notes, many of them chose to move to the cities, but some of them still stayed in the South. Now, right before this time period, at the end of the Civil War, we passed 3 amendments that are going to make a difference to many African Americans. These amendments include Amendment 13, which ended slavery, Amendment 14, which promised equal protection of the laws to all American citizens, and 13 made former slave citizens, and 15, which promised voting rights to all male citizens. So the Jim Crow laws are going to try to essentially violate these amendments so that they keep African Americans from having the same rights and from getting the same treatment in America, in the South especially. What we find in this time period is there are many Americans, especially Southerners, who don't want blacks to get equal rights. And so they find ways around these amendments. So they can't get around Amendment 13. You have to have an end to slavery. There's not really a way around that. But Amendment 14, the equal protection, they come up with the idea of segregation. And segregation is even kept in place and allowed. Separate but equal was legal because of the court case Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896. So we know that it was even supported by the federal government. Then we get these Jim Crow laws down in the South. They deal with the voting rights. We have things like grandfather clauses and poll taxes and literacy tests. So the way these worked, grandfather clauses, if your grandfather was able to vote, you don't have to worry about the rest. Well, that's only going to apply to white people, right? Because your grandfather, if you were black in 1890, your grandfather was a slave. So he didn't vote. Literacy tests were a way of getting and checking if African Americans could read. But here's the trick, and there are a couple that are coming up. They were not made in a way that was really about reading. You had to answer the question correctly or you must not have understood it, and they had some hard questions on there. So it wasn't really about literacy, it was about keeping people from voting. And go ahead, if you want, go ahead and pause and look at some of these literacy tests that are up here. So I have, I think, 3 different examples, 2 or 3 examples, possibly just 2, of some literacy tests. I believe it's Louisiana and Alabama. May have had Tennessee on here. Go ahead and look at some of those questions and see, would you be able to pass the literacy test? Now, if you were an African American who was able to pass the literacy test, and another piece that made it really hard to pass those literacy tests was, as slaves, you weren't allowed to be taught to read and write. So how are you going to pass a literacy test? The other piece that made it really hard was the poll taxes. So if you manage to get past the grandfather clause and you manage to get past the literacy test, so you took the literacy test because your grandfather did not vote, now you actually have to pay a tax to vote. And the poor blacks in the South were not able to do that. This even keeps poor whites from voting. And so it was really, these 3 things together were to keep African Americans in the South especially from voting. And if they did manage to get to vote, they were going to vote the way the white people who were running the polls wanted them to. So this is definitely a way to keep African Americans from not gaining equal rights and equal treatment. It stops them from gaining political power by voting, but it also is stopping them from gaining economic and social power because they have no say in the laws that are being passed and the fair treatment of African Americans or others. So with these problems, we have some people who come up with some solutions and fight for different ways of gaining power and rights for African Americans. And these progressives who are approaching race problems in the United States really have 4 different ways of approaching them. The first is protests. The idea behind protests is to gain public awareness for the problems and therefore change them. So they would protest lynchings and unfair treatment. The second is an economic approach. And the most famous person, or the most famous Black African American progressive who is promoting this economic approach is Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington argues that the way to fix this whole race problem, as we'll call it, is to get economic equality, and if you control the money, you can then control the politics and society. So he feels like economics comes first, and it will force the political issues and the social issues. So he really argues for gaining better jobs, and through that, doing that through vocational education, so becoming skilled laborers versus the unskilled laborers that we see so much of during this time period. So as we're moving north and there's so many unskilled jobs, the people who get more respect are the skilled laborers, and Booker T. Washington really wants more African Americans to fit that category, and therefore they will have the money to be able to fight for other powers like political and social equality. Now we have some other views as well from African American progressives. The next is this whole political approach. So Webb, or W.E.B. Du Bois, is one of the people who fights for this. He's an African American who believes that if you can gain voting rights, if you can gain political equality, you can force the social issues and you can force the economic issues and you can fix those through laws and legal means, but you have to have the political equality to do that. So he really fights for voting rights. Now our third progressive African American with an approach to changing things, he has a social approach, and he actually is more radical than the other two, at least as far as when we're looking at it. So socially, Marcus Garvey felt like there was no way African Americans could ever gain equality in the U.S. So we have this history of slavery, we have this history of mistreatment, and it's never going to be fixed. It's never going to go away. So Marcus Garvey's idea was actually that African Americans needed to leave the U.S. and create their own separate country where they could govern, which would give them political equality. They would run the businesses, economic equality, and they would be the ones who lived there, so social equality. He really felt like they needed to leave, and he actually started trying to get support to send African Americans to colonize Africa and make an entire country of former slaves and their descendants in order to gain that equality. So African American progressives are fighting for equality, fighting for better treatment through those 4 means: protest, economic approach, social approach, and political approach. And we've got some leaders in those areas. So now, meanwhile, at the same time, we have women fighting for equality and fairness, not just for themselves, but also for some other issues as well. So women had a very broad range of things they were focused on. Now, it wasn't just women, but these causes dealt with women, and we had a lot of female progressives. So a lot of women were progressives. And if you think about the issues they were talking about, child labor, living conditions, working conditions, wages, unfair treatment, a lot of those applied to women or things that were immediately in their lives. So we had some different things that middle-class women and working-class women were concerned with, but they were all concerned with supporting social and economic equality and fixing those things. For middle-class women, their biggest issues tended to be children and children's issues, whether it was child labor or just the raising of children, living conditions of the poor. Having seen Jacob Riis's book, How the Other Half Lives, this was in their head, and also alcohol's influence on family life and how they felt like it was destroying society. And that becomes a really big issue that we'll talk about. Now, while middle class women cared about those things, working class women, their big issues were wages, because that's going to greatly impact their lives, child labor, again, something that immediately impacts their lives, and working conditions, because working class women were working. And after seeing things like the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire, they really saw the dangers and wanted those things fixed. So all of this kind of comes together, and they decide one of the big issues that could really fix a lot of this is temperance or prohibition. And so alcohol is seen as a problem, and women are at the forefront of fighting to change the availability of alcohol in order to fix many of the social and economic problems that they are seeing in the US. So I just threw out these two terms for you, so we want to make sure that you know what they mean. So the two terms are temperance and prohibition. Temperance is the belief that alcohol caused many of society's problems. So if we get rid of alcohol, it will fix many of the, like I said, social problems, violence in families, poor living conditions. It will also fix some economic problems because husbands won't spend all their money on alcohol. Prohibition is the legal outlawing of alcohol. So temperance is the belief we need to get rid of it. Prohibition is the legal action. So those are two definitions, and I'll use those words as we go through this, so you need to know them. So both male and female progressives supported the idea of temperance for fixing many of society's problems. So the way they looked at this was that if we can eliminate this evil alcohol, it's going to fix people's lives. So the working class and poor, the men would get their paycheck, and instead of stopping in the saloon on their way home and spending all the money and then having none for food and rent and things like that at home, it would all go home, and then they could spend it on their families. It would improve family life. It would get rid of violence in the family. It would improve living conditions, and we could end poverty and improve society through banning alcohol. So people really supported this idea, and like I said, not just women, men as well, and there were really some pushes to get this passed, because many people felt this would keep all of society's problems in the background. There wouldn't be as much, because you would fix the main problem that led to all the other problems. So this fight for temperance and prohibition, for ending alcohol, banning alcohol, actually leads to a bigger fight for women's suffrage. It leads to a support for women getting the right to vote, because women start to realize, and the men who support them start to realize, the way to get enough votes to have prohibition passed is if women can vote. So they can only really change things if they have the right to vote, they have the right to have a say in the laws, and who makes the laws. And so they start to fight for women's suffrage. So it kind of shifts the focus for many women and really puts suffrage and voting at the forefront for women. So that means there is another term that you should know, and that is suffrage, because I'm going to use this over and over. Suffrage is simply the right to vote. So you might have women's suffrage, that is women's right to vote, African American suffrage, which is African Americans' right to vote, but suffrage is the right to vote. So you need to know that term. Now, there are also a lot of people who are anti-suffrage or against women getting the right to vote. And these include both men and women. It is not solely a male issue to be against women's rights to vote. Many women also were against women's right to vote. So we had many immigrants and working class men who don't want to give up their alcohol, so they're against suffrage. We have many middle and upper class men who feel like they're taking care of their women, so why should they have to give women the right to vote? So the working class see it as if women get the right to vote, they'll lose in prohibition and temperance. The upper class feel like, well, they're already doing what they should. Women don't need the right to vote, they'll take care of it. It's also seen as being unfeminine and immoral that women want this. Many women who are suffragists are actually attacked and physically attacked and beaten. So we really have a lot of problems. It also weakens it that many women who support suffrage are also abolitionists. or were abolitionists and support African American rights, which is weakening their arguments and really drawing attention from the bigger issue of suffrage. So that doesn't mean there aren't those that support suffrage. So even though these are big arguments and have large groups of people, and obviously suffrage gained a lot of support since women can vote today. So pro-suffrage, we call these women suffragists or suffragettes. They're the women who supported suffrage. We had NAWSA, N-A-W-S-A, the National American Women's Suffrage Association, who actually had people like Susan B. Anthony, who you may have heard of, running it, as well as Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Carrie Chapman Catt. Now, one of the women, they were fighting for state-to-state suffrage and wanted to gain it at the state level. Then we have people like Alice Paul, who was fighting for the amendment to pass. And actually there was a split in women suffragists over the amendment and who should we do it at the state level, should we do it at the national level? So Alice Paul actually split with NAWSA and started her own group in order to do that. And if you haven't seen the video Iron Jawed Angels and you didn't come to the after school one, you really should try to see that, because it really shows Alice Paul, the fight for suffrage, and what the women went through to get an amendment that allowed them to vote. So this was not a quick fight, this was not an easy fight. It took many protests, actually jailings, hunger strikes, all kinds of things led to women gaining the right to vote eventually. Now, this does lead to 2 amendments getting passed, and we'll mention these again when we talk about the national politics of the day in our next section in Unit 1. So Unit 1, Section 4, actually, we'll talk about that. But the 2 amendments that are passed are first Amendment 18, which is prohibition and the banning of alcohol. So it passes in 1918, partly because of social pressure from temperance organizations, but also because of World War I and the need for supporting the troops. So they really used the war to get that passed. The second amendment we're talking about is Amendment 19, the Women's Suffrage Amendment. And Amendment 19 is passed in 1920 as a result of social pressure from suffragists pushing for this national reform, not going state by state. Alice Paul is very successful in this. Now, one thing I do want to point out is that both temperance and women's suffrage are passed. Amendment 18 comes before 19. 2 years before women can vote nationally, they pass prohibition. So although women are very involved in it, men are the ones who vote it into place. So these are the big issues of the time period for women and African Americans, and the big ways that they're fighting for those issues and fighting for change. So this ends the notes for Unit 1, Part 2 on your study guide, and next week we'll do Unit 1, Part 3, which is national politics and issues.